Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building the CMS application using ASP.NET Core 3 and Angular 10. In the last video tutorial, in the Angular application, we implemented AuthGuard service, which is used to protect the routes in our application. So if someone is trying to access a route which is protected with authentication, then that route would not be accessed. Instead, the user will be redirected to the login page so that they can log in and then return to the initial route that they were trying to access. To get more information on authentication guard service that we implemented, watch the last video tutorial of this video tutorial series. In this video tutorial, we will be focusing on creating authentication handlers for our users that make requests from our Angular application. In the admin panel, when we worked on the admin panel, while creating the admin user, we had created the admin authentication handler. This authentication handler makes sure that the user role, if the user role is administrator, then we can allow that specific request to further process or access the protected action methods in our application. For example, if we go to the user controller, this user controller can only be accessed by the admin user. That's because we have placed a authorize attribute. We have specified a custom authentication scheme, which is the admin authentication scheme. And the admin authentication scheme, under the admin authentication scheme, we only allow users with administrator role to access that particular controller. So in this case, this controller can only be accessed by admin user. So all these methods indirectly now are protected and can only be accessed by users whose role is administrator. But if we go to the profile controller API, we have not implemented any authorized attribute on this profile controller, which means that at this point, any user or user with any role can access this particular endpoint. We want to limit the access only to users with a specific role, which are not admin but which are regular users in our application. And to do that, we are going to create a new authentication handler in our filter service. We have previously created admin authentication handlers and we have explained in detail how the authentication handler works, what is the process. So we will not be explaining a lot of stuff in detail because it's already covered in the admin authentication handler video tutorial that we have uploaded for this video tutorial series. If you would need any more information, please go ahead and watch that video tutorial before you watch this video tutorial for the user authentication handler. But I'll try my best to explain uh, and keep it short what exactly this process does and how we can use it. So without wasting any further time, let's go ahead and create the user authentication handler so that we can place it on the controllers that are accessed by our Angular application users. So to create the user authentication handler, we will go to our filter service project. And here in the filter service project, we are going to add a new class. We are going to call this class as user authentication handler and we are going to hit new. Now we will go ahead and extend this class or inherit this class from authentication handler class and specify the user authentication options. Even though we are not passing any custom options, we need to specify a user authentication options class that we would be using for the authentication handler. So let's first go ahead and create that class before we do an extension over here. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to add another file and I'm going to call this as user authentication options, and I'm going to save this file. Now the next thing that I would want to do, we don't need the constructor, so I'm going to get rid of the constructor and I'm going to extend this class from the authentication scheme option. So the authentication scheme options class, we are going to extend it with our class which is called as user authentication option. and I'm going to specify the missing import, which is Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication. Here we can specify custom authentication options that we need, that we want to pass to the authentication handler. But in this project, we don't need to specify any options. So we are going to leave this class blank. We are not going to specify any properties here or members. So we will go back to our user authentication handler, and now we will make sure we extend this class from ASP.NET Core Authentication Handler. So we have to import the missing import statement, which is ASP.NET Core Authentication. And here we have to specify the options class that we have created. Next thing, we have to implement the missing members in this authentication handler class. Since we are uh, extending the authentication handler class, we need to specify some options that we need to pass to the base constructor of this class. So let's go ahead and specify those options. First thing that we will do is we will have to override the default authentication process. So the way we authenticate the users, we will be providing our own logic. Therefore, we need to override the default handle authenticate async method. Now we are using the asynchronous version of this method. There's a non-asynchronous version also available. Since we are using asynchronous, I have to use the async operator over here. This would be a task, so I need to import the system threading tasks into this class. And here we are going to specify the logic. Before we start working on the logic, we need to go ahead and inject some dependencies to the controller. Also, we need to pass these dependencies to the base constructor. So let's go ahead and do that. So here I have added the properties that we are going to use while we work on the logic of the handle authenticate async method. We are going to soon inject these values with dependency injection, but you would have to go ahead and reference the authentication service. So right click on the filter service project, go to add, reference, and then reference the auth service project and click OK. Once it's done, you will be able to add the using statement for auth service, import statement for authentication service. Here we would have to go ahead and instantiate these values using dependency injection, but you will notice there is a string array called as user roles. That's because I want this particular authentication handler to provide access to administrator and customer roles. In the authentication handler for admin, the authentication handler for admin only provides access to the user with administrator role or the roles that we have specified here. That's because the profile controller has the endpoints that are also accessed by administrator role users. So if admin wants to access their user activities, change their password, update their profile, or get their own profile and view their profile details, we are calling the same endpoints. So if I just give access to a user role which is customer and not administrator, so our admin would not be able to access these endpoints. Therefore, to make sure customers and administrator has access to these endpoints, I have specified two roles in this user roles array. You can add multiple roles because that's how we are going to implement the logic, and we are going to use this user roles array to verify if this particular user with a role is allowed to view a particular class. So you will see that when we make use of this object in our authenticate method. Now let's go ahead and instantiate these values using dependency injection in the constructor. So I'll go ahead and instantiate the required objects. So you have added the required objects that I want to inject. These services will be acquired from the pipeline of our application because we have injected these services. Also, we need to make sure that we pass the required services to or the objects to the base constructor. So if we go to the authentication handlers constructor, here you will see that in the authentication handlers constructor, we have to specify the options, the logger, the encoder, and the clock. Therefore, we are going to make sure we instantiate these objects over here. or inject these objects over here in the constructor and pass it to the base constructor. So the next thing, let's go ahead and assign the values to our objects that we have over here in this class that we have created. So here I have assigned the values. Now I can access these objects over here to get the values of user manager, app settings, our provider service, and the other objects that I have instantiated over here. So let's work on the handle authentication async method, because this is the method that we are going to use to implement the logic of validating the incoming request from any users from the Angular application. So here in the handle authenticate async method, I have implemented the entire logic that is required. I have also placed the step numbers with some description which will tell you what exactly these steps do. But we will still go ahead and go through each step. So the first thing that we will do over here before we start the try catch block is we are going to check that the request that is coming in, that request contains cookies, and in the specific cookie we have the user ID and the access token. So here I have implemented three if conditions. The first condition checks if the cookies contains the cookies with the name, access token, and user ID. If you scroll up, these names are provided here in the objects that we have created. So user ID is basically user underscore ID, where the cookie in the browser is stored with this specific string. The key of that specific cookie is user underscore ID. So I'm using the cookie name or the cookie key to identify in the headers if that particular cookie exists. If the cookie does not exist, then I'm going to log an error in the log file stating that no access token or user ID found. And I'm going to return a authentication result, which is basically no result, which means that the authentication has failed. So when we return a result, this particular logic will not be processed any further. Now all these checks have passed. We have a cookie in the token. We have fetched the values of that cookies. Now we have those cookies. Now we can go ahead and execute this try catch block where we have different steps implemented. First thing, before we go ahead and validate the token that we received in the cookie or the user ID that we received in the cookie, we need to decrypt these values, because when we store them in the browser cookie, we have encrypted these values with some layers of encryption. To decrypt these cookies, first thing we need to do is create protection service, get the decryption key, and then decrypt them. So let's say now in this first step here, we want to decrypt the access token, which is basically a JWT token. So first thing we need is to get our validation parameters. Now the validation parameters are the parameters that we have used to encrypt the cookie. Now while decrypting the cookie, we are going to make sure that we decrypt the cookie based on the same validation parameters. Of any of these validation parameters does not match the decrypted cookie, then that cookie is invalid. For example, if we in our application have implemented that validate issuer within the JWT token, but when we decrypt the token, we would make sure that we will validate the issuer. So all the parameters we have set them over here in the app settings file. If you can in the startup file. So if we go to the startup.cs file of our application and you scroll down, you will see these values that we have, or these options that we have implemented over here. So the JWT authentication service, we have made sure that we we have the validate issuer, audience, and the following values have been implemented here in the startup class. So we are using the same validation parameters to validate our cookie. So next thing, we will go ahead and validate this cookie, but we will have to first decrypt this cookie. So we need an instance of the protector provider, which is the service that is already running. So we will have to use the provider to get that specific service instance. We will create a protector. Using that protector, we will unprotect the cookie. So we have now decrypted this cookie in the first layer. We have two layers of encryption. So the first layer of decryption is done. Now we will go ahead and decrypt the second layer of the cookie. And to decrypt the second layer, we need a key. That key was used to encrypt this cookie, and that specific key is stored in the user's token table. So in the token table, there is a entry with that specific user's ID, and there is a key associated with that specific user. That key was used to encrypt this token. So we need that key now to decrypt that token. So we will make use of our DB context service, and we will go to that table, get the specific key based on the user's user ID, the username, and then once we have that, we will go ahead and make sure we decrypt that token. Finally, we will go ahead and apply the second layer of decryption. Here, rather than me going over all these steps, we can check this in live mode. I'm going to place a breakpoint over here. So when this authenticate method is called, we can loop through or go through each step while it's being processed, so we can understand it much better. And then I can also explain it to you while the process is going on. So for now, I'll just place a breakpoint over here, but I will go through it when we run the application. So now we are going to save this authentication handler that we have created. We have implemented the logic over here. And the other thing that I would like to mention, which is in the admin authentication handler, we have implemented a method called as handle challenge async, which is also overridden. That's the method that we use in case the authentication fails. In our Angular application, we don't need to redirect the user to some other page. Therefore, I have not implemented this method. So we don't need that in the user authentication handler. So now the user authentication handler is created. We would now also need to inject this user authentication handler in the pipeline. Therefore, we'll go to the startup class of our main project. We'll scroll to the section which says authentication schemes and service. Here we will specify our second authentication scheme and service that we have created for the handler. So I'm going to place it over here, and the authentication scheme name is user, and the scheme that we are adding is the user authentication option and the user authentication handler. So we specify the scheme name, and here for the options, we will leave it null because we have not implemented any options. As I mentioned, we are not covering options in this specific video tutorial series, but you can go ahead and read the Microsoft documentation on if you want to implement options while injecting this service, how you can implement and what options you can implement. Since we don't require it for this project, I am not going to spend time on explaining the particular feature. So now I'm going to save this authentication service that I have just injected in the pipeline. Next, I want to use it on the controller classes. So the controller class that I want to use it is on the profile controller. So in the profile controller, I'm going to place the authorize attribute here, and the authorize attribute, I'll specify my custom authentication scheme, and the custom authentication scheme is user. That's the name that we have provided over here while we have added this particular scheme to the pipeline. So now I will go ahead and save this file. Now when I run this application, this authentication scheme will be available in our service. It's up and running. This authentication scheme will validate the incoming request based on this particular logic, which we are going to go through, as I said, and I've placed my debugging points over here so that we can go through it in step by step. So now we have implemented this authentication scheme in order to test this authentication scheme, we would have to first go ahead, build our application and then run it. So let's go ahead and build our application or our project. So the build was successful. We don't have any errors. Now let's go ahead and run our application. So the application is loaded. We'll go to the login page and try to log in as a regular user. We will go ahead and now notice that when we log in as a user, the first thing that we do in our Angular application is get the user's profile. So when we try to get the user's profile, the get user profile method is part of the profile controller. So we have an API endpoint called as get user profile, and in the get user profile method that we are trying to access here, this method is not yet being called because first we have to go through these particular checks, which is the authorized attribute which was called. The authentication scheme that we specified was user authentication handler. Therefore our breakpoint over here is now hit. Services have been injected and the handle authenticate async method, which we have overridden with our custom logic, has been called. Now first thing here we check in this method is if the request contains any cookies with the following name, which is access token and user ID, which we have defined over here, and the values are basically the name of the cookie. So if we go and if we check if this particular request contains these cookies, we can go ahead and check that over here, and here you can see that the request cookie contains the following keys: the user ID and the access token. Therefore we can now make sure that this condition will pass. So once we pass all these condition checks that we have specified over here, we will jump to the try catch block. So as you can see, all these conditions have passed. We were able to get the values of the cookie, that is the user ID and access token, from the request. Next thing, we are going to go to step 1, where we will get the validation parameters for our JWT token, and we will create an object of JWT security handler which will be used to validate our tokens. So I'm going to place a breakpoint over here and I am going to hit next. So now we have these validation parameters, but before we go ahead and we use these validation parameters, we need to go ahead and decrypt this token. The value of this particular token is encrypted right now, so we cannot read it. And to decrypt this token, we have to use our decryption service, which is the Microsoft's data protection service, which we use in this application to encrypt the strings in the browser, which we have stored as cookie. So here the following key that we use. This key is defined in the app settings file. So we use this key to encrypt and decrypt the cookies in the first layer. So you can change these keys or specify them somewhere else based on your requirement. I have put them in the app settings file, but usually you would want to put them in much safer place like Azure Vault. Depends on your requirement and your project. For this project, we are using the app settings file. So we get this key and we use this key to create our protector instance. Then we will go ahead and decrypt the token. So if we go to the next, that is the step 6 over here, first layer, we will try to unprotect the user ID. From the header, we have received the user ID. As you can see over here in the header, we have the user ID. So we are trying to first unprotect it and get the value out of it. So if I place it here now, here you can see the decrypted token looks something like this now. This is our decrypted token, and this is the decrypted user ID, because we have only one layer of protection on the user ID. So you can read this value. This is the actual user ID that we have stored in the database for the user, but our token still remains encrypted, so we need to further decrypt it. So we will go ahead and decrypt it using the key that we have created for that specific token, and that key is stored in the token table with the user's ID. So we will go ahead and fetch that key and the value from the database. So once we have done that, we should be able to have a token model, and these are the values that we have received from our database for the user whose user ID is the following user ID that we just decrypted. So we will go ahead and then validate the token. If the token is valid, we will make sure that the uh, users the other details, like we will get the user by their email. We will check all the following things before we go ahead and create the authentication ticket for the user. So you can go through it step by step. We have already covered this information in the admin authentication handler, and I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining each and every step over here. Please do watch the admin authentication handler video where we have covered all these steps in detail. But to make it easy for you to understand, I have specified all the descriptions over here for each step, why we have implemented that and what each step does. So it will be easy for you to understand and debug the code. Here, while we try to decrypt the token, if there is any kind of exception, if the token is invalid or expired, we will throw an exception. Now we have to check if the token is expired. If the token is expired and we have refresh token functionality enabled in our application, once again, this particular refresh token functionality, we specify that in the app settings file. So we decide if in the site wide settings, in the app settings file, we decide whether we want to allow token refreshing in our application. So in the app settings section, you will see there is a key which says allow site-wide token refresh. Right now I have set it to true. So which means if the value is set to true, then the user's token will be refreshed, and the user's token once is refreshed, the user will remain active. So every time we receive a valid token that is expired, we will refresh the user's token using the refresh token method that we have implemented in the auth service. So back to the authentication handler over here. First thing we check if the token is expired, then we go ahead and check if the token refresh is on. We will go ahead and refresh the token. Once the token is refreshed, we will create the authentication ticket and send it back. Once the authentication ticket is created with the result success, we return it back. So in this case, we will go ahead and continue the debug. So once the ticket is successful, as you can see, therefore we were able to access the profile controller. I put a breakpoint here on the constructor of the profile controller. So we were able to get into this profile controller class. If the authentication fails, we would not be able to access this profile controller. So now we have the profile controller able to be accessed by this incoming request, and if we hit this continue button, go back to our app, we should be able to see our profile. So uh, we don't have any issues over here. This was because I was causing the delay with the debug. So if I had to refresh this, now I'll remove all the breakpoints. So as you can see, every time I will try to access a protected page, from the profile controller, the authentication handler will be fired, and the request will be validated before the controllers members are accessed. So if I go back now to the browser, without any breakpoint and delays, you can see that I have no errors, and all the time I'm trying to access, the values are being fetched with the authentication ticket being successful. In this way, we have protected the API endpoints for only those users who have specific roles and who have been authenticated, which means they already have a token and they have a specific role. We have allowed them to access these particular endpoints. So let's say tomorrow in your application you want to have a guest user with not all functionalities. You want to charge them for some other functionalities or limit them to certain features. Then you can use authentication handlers to do that. Based on the logic you implement, you can show or hide features or endpoints to the incoming requests. So in this tutorial, what we have learned how to implement authentication handlers to protect the backend API endpoints when calling them from our Angular application. So users with specific roles will be allowed to access the endpoints based on the authentication ticket, and also we will refresh the user's token if the token refresh functionality is set to true. So if you decrease the token time in the app settings file, so right now if I go to cookies and if I check the cookies, here you can see that the uh, user token and refresh token has a expiry time. This expiry time is basically set in the app settings file. If you want to test the refresh token functionality, you can go ahead, stop the application. You can change the expiry time to 2 minutes, and or let's say I can just keep it 1 minute and I'll set the refresh token expiry time to 2 minutes. So we should be able to see the token being refreshed. Now I'll go ahead and run this application so we can test the refresh token functionality. So the application is loaded. I will go ahead and log out from the application so I can log in again, and new tokens with new expiry times are created. So I go to application, go to the cookies over here. I will log in now. Once I log in, you can see the expiry time of the tokens, and this will be refreshed after 1 minute. We know that the access token is going to expire. So once the token expires, uh, we will be able to see a new time being shown over here, and we have to do it before the refresh token expires. If both these tokens expire, then we cannot refresh the request or refresh our tokens. A refresh token needs to be valid in order for refresh token functionality to be working. So we have set the expiry time to 1 minute. So I've just forwarded this video. So now let's go ahead and refresh this request. So far, not yet 1 minute. So I will keep refreshing it. Right now, the time is 46:27. We should see it being updated. As you can see, the time is now updated. We can see the access token is 47:52. It was 46. Now the time has increased, which means a token also has been updated. So in this way, you can check if the refresh token functionality is working. Our tokens are refreshed. Make sure that when you try to refresh the token, you try to call the endpoint that has the attribute authorized attribute set for it, so that the refresh token functionality is called. So now when I try to refresh this token once again after a minute, I should see a new expiry time over here. That's because the refresh token functionality is set to true. In the app settings, if I change it to false, the refresh token functionality will be set to false, and the tokens will not expire, or will expire and not refresh. So once again, the token got refreshed. You can see the expiry time increased. That's because the token was not valid. It was expired. Uh, Therefore, we have now increased the uh, token time, and we have created a new token. So we have covered two parts right now. We have covered the authentication handler and implemented the refresh token functionality. I will go back to the app settings file and change this to my previous values, which was 1 and 2 hours respectively, because keeping the expiry time 1 minute, depending on your requirement and application, you can do it. Certain applications require tokens to expire within 5 minutes, 1 minute, but in this specific application I don't want my tokens to expire within 1 minute, so I will save the initial values that I had. So you can go ahead and play around with these values. So now the video has ended, so I would recommend you to go ahead and download the source code if you need it from the DevOps repo, where the link will be provided in the video description. Do not forget to like and subscribe our channel Tech Howdy. If you have any questions that you did not understand and you are not clear about any topic that I discussed here, I will be happy to answer those questions. But please remember that authentication handler is covered in detail in the admin authentication handler video. So I recommend you to go ahead and watch that video before you go ahead and ask me questions about what this particular handler does, because that video has covered most of these topics or the processes that we have used in this handler. So once again, do not forget to like and subscribe our channel Tech Howdy. And in the next video tutorial, I will show you guys how to use the forgot password functionality from the Angular application. And we also have to implement the two-factor authentication. We will implement that in the upcoming videos. So for now, thank you.